Autumn, 1871. Chicago was not just a city. It was a ticking bomb. It was the fastest growing metropolis on the planet. A marvel of pure, reckless ambition that rocketed from a muddy trading post to a sprawling empire of 300,000 people in a single generation. But that relentless speed had a dark, fatal flaw. The city was a tinderbox. Wooden sidewalks, pine-framed houses, factories capped with highly flammable tar. Chicago was so blinded by its own progress that it completely ignored the warning signs piling up like sawdust. For months, it hadn't rained. The bone-dry streets baked under a relentless sun. The city's exhausted firefighters were battered, their equipment pushed to the absolute breaking point. The stage was perfectly set. The fuel was primed. All it would take was one spark to detonate the bomb. How do you build a city-sized explosive? You start with wood, endless, towering piles of it. In Chicago's desperate race to expand, speed was everything. Cost was everything else. Developers threw up entire city blocks using a fast, dirty method known as balloon framing. Light pine skeletons slapped together in a matter of days. Efficient? Absolutely. But they were essentially hollow flues, designed perfectly to draw fire upward. Over 2/3 of Chicago's buildings were pure wood. Roofs were soaked in tar. The roads were paved with pine blocks. Over 100 miles of sidewalks were elevated wooden planks. Squeezed between these wooden structures were massive lumber yards, coal depots, and barns stuffed with dry hay. This was not a functioning city. It was a perfectly engineered bonfire. The geography itself was a trap. Built on a flat, marshy swamp, there were no hills or valleys to act as natural fire breaks. And then there was the wind. A harsh, dry gale blowing constantly from the southwest. A giant bellows aimed directly at the city's heart. The fire marshal had begged for better equipment. He warned of the skyrocketing fire risks. No one listened. The boom was too loud. The money was too good. No one wanted to admit that the very engine driving their massive growth was the exact ingredient for their total destruction. On the evening of Sunday, October 8th, the inevitable spark finally caught. It ignited in a small barn on the city's west side, inside a dense neighborhood of wooden cottages on Decoven Street. Almost immediately, a piece of folklore was born. A story so catchy it survived for over a century. A cow kicked over a lantern, and the city burned. It is a simple, memorable story. It is also a fabricated lie. A reporter later admitted he invented the cow narrative for a colorful headline, using a poor immigrant family as the perfect scapegoat for a systemic failure. The truth is, the exact origin of the spark does not matter. The true cause was the city itself. Whether it was a careless gambler or a dropped match, the conditions were already lethal. When those first flames flickered around 9 p.m., they didn't just find a barn. They found a neighborhood completely devoid of moisture, built entirely of kindling and waiting to explode. The official response was a catastrophic failure. A watchman high in the courthouse tower spotted the glow, but misjudged the coordinates. He sent the first fire crews nearly a mile in the wrong direction. That single delay sealed the city's fate. By the time the exhausted crews finally reached Decoven Street, they were no longer fighting a barn fire. They were fighting a block fire, and they were losing. The fierce, relentless southwest wind whipped glowing embers high into the night sky, carrying the inferno directly toward the city center. Witnesses did not describe a normal blaze. They described a white melting heat, a shower of sparks falling like golden snow. Firefighters prayed the south branch of the Chicago River would act as a natural defense. They were wrong. Around midnight, The superheated gale launched a massive burning timber clear across the water. It smashed into a planing mill and the city gasworks. The fire had jumped the river. Now it was roaring into the central business district, a dense forest of supposedly fireproof buildings constructed of stone, brick, and iron. But the heat was unearthly. The fire grew so massive, so violently intense, it created its own weather system, a firestorm. Superheated air rushed skyward, sucking in massive amounts of oxygen from the ground, spawning terrifying tornadic whirls of flame. Fire devils. The temperature hit an estimated 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Solid iron columns melted like wax. Marble facades crumbled into fine dust. Indestructible buildings collapsed into ash. Panic consumed the streets. And then, at 3 a.m., the ultimate death blow. A flaming chunk of debris struck the roof of the city's waterworks. Within minutes, the massive pumps failed. Across the entire burning metropolis, every hydrant went bone dry. The hoses went limp in the firefighters' hands. The fight was over. The city was completely, utterly helpless. The bomb had detonated. Unstoppable, the fire jumped the main branch of the river. It tore through the north side, feeding for the rest of Monday, until it finally hit the empty prairie. It didn't stop because it was defeated. It stopped because it ran out of city to burn. Tuesday morning, a light rain fell on pure apocalyptic devastation. A scorched scar, 4 miles long and nearly a mile wide, had been violently carved through the heart of Chicago. 3.3 square miles. Gone. 17,500 buildings. Gone. Over 73 miles of streets. Vanished. At least 300 people were dead, though the true toll was likely much higher. 100,000 people. A full third of the entire population. Left homeless, wandering in shock along the cold shores of Lake Michigan. The richest commercial district in America was reduced to a smoking wasteland. Over $200 million in property simply ceased to exist. The editor of the Chicago Tribune wrote that the scene was too vast, too swift, too full of smoke, too full of danger for anybody to see it all. The wonder of the modern age had been erased. In the suffocating silence that followed, the world assumed Chicago was dead. Whispers claimed the city would be abandoned, but they vastly underestimated the defiance of its survivors. While the rubble was still radiating heat, the rebuilding began. This time, there would be no balloon-framed illusions. The fire was a brutal, unforgiving lesson in physics and hubris. The city council rushed to pass uncompromising fire codes. Wood was outlawed in the downtown district. Brick, heavy stone, and a revolutionary new material took its place: steel. The erasure of the city created the greatest architectural puzzle of the 19th century. Downtown land was incredibly valuable, but traditional building methods severely limited height. The solution came from a bold new generation of engineers, known as the Chicago School. If they couldn't build outward, they would build upward. By engineering an internal steel skeleton to carry a building's massive weight, they shattered all previous limits. The fireproof, towering skyscraper was born directly from the smoking ashes of a wooden trap. Chicago did not just rebuild. It completely reinvented the concept of the modern metropolis. Today, the exact site where the fire began is the Chicago Fire Department's training academy. The city that built a bomb and watched it detonate in the most spectacular disaster imaginable used the sheer force of that blast to forge a taller, stronger, indestructible identity. The Great Fire of 1871 was not the end of Chicago. It was the violent, fiery crucible that created the modern skyline. But Chicago's history was only threatened by fire. Its legacy was proudly immortalized in steel. Some histories, however, don't get rebuilt. They get buried. What happens when an entire population is deliberately erased from the textbooks? Not by a natural disaster, but by a catastrophic, intentional cover-up? If you think the destruction of a city is the ultimate historical tragedy, you need to uncover the chilling truth of the Devil's Punch Bowl. Click the video on your screen right now to watch the horrifying fate of 20,000 freed African Americans nobody knows about. I'll see you there. Never stop asking questions, because something in the dark is always listening back. If you feel it, share and subscribe.